Welcome, welcome, welcome to this Elephants Don't Forget and Complyport webinar. I'm delighted to see so many of you participating and attending this webinar. Just a few housekeeping points from my side of things. If you would like to pose a question to our panelists, you can do so on the, thank you very much for that. You can actually do that using the Q&A. And you can pose it and tick anonymous if you don't want your details to be shared with ourselves as panelists, or alternatively other individuals. Alternatively, you can use the chat to post your comments and to post your questions to either myself, Graham and Adrian. Alternatively, you can just share your thoughts on the surveys and the polls that we'll be asking you to complete over the next hour or so. There. A PDF version of the slides will be made available at the end of the webinar alongside a recording of the webinar. There are lots of you joining in, so if you want to get your questions in, please pose them and send those to us now. They get to the top of the leaderboard and we will try to answer them, but if we can't, genuinely, if you're saying, what would you do in my situation, I would suggest that you take that offline and we'll try and answer it as quickly and as effectively as possible there afterwards. Wonderful and delightful to see so many of you participating in this webinar. So let's get started. Welcome to this Elephants Don't Forget and Complyport joint webinar, where we discuss each and every month, and it has been literally each and every month. The Consumer Duty Challenge is, well, it may be a heat wave in other parts of Europe, but it's certainly hot under the collar for many. Or do you see what I did there? Hot under the collar of what many of you in financial services are experiencing and facing. 10 days and counting, Graham reminds me of, I think even on last webinars, my kids know it's the consumer duty deadline in the house, and such is life with us in the Allen household. Delighted to be welcomed with Adrian Harvey, CEO of Elephants Don't Forget, and Graham Levi-Samper, Director of Complyport as well. Delighted for you guys to join us on this webinar here. We've got a lot to cover off. Obviously, we will love your participation and engagement with the poll questions. We'd love you to actually make sure you sign up to both our updates and our thought leadership on respective subjects. Certainly day one, but also day two, which is implementation and BAU activity around consumer duty there. We'll send you a PDF version of the slides as well as a recording on request there. This is what we're going to cover off. Applying the FCA's 10 questions, which you're all familiar with. We'll post that in the chat. If you don't know the link to that, we'll get that sorted out for you. We're also going to be looking at the MI that the FCA has asked you to provide or supply for that, as well as our suggestive list of MI and data and metrics that you can use to enhance effectively monitoring and measuring good customer outcomes. Also, pre-flight checklist, not necessarily for your bucket and spade foreign holiday, but for your pre-flight checklist for what you can realistically do to actually make sure that you're in a good position or a better position to actually ensure implementation of good customer outcomes. And also looking ahead, how do you transition from consumer duty implementation to BAU? Really, really critical for that to happen within your organization. But we always love to get started with a poll question. Many familiar faces on this webinar, so love to see what you do. This is absolutely confidential, so we want to get a sense check of where you are and also where perhaps we can help and support and steer the rest of this conversation as well for the next 50 or so minutes there. So will your firm be fully compliant stroke ready by the 31st of July deadline? So single choice answer, will your firm be fully compliant or ready by the 31st of July deadline? Welcome Adrian, welcome Graham to this webinar as well.
Thank you.
Where are we, guys, with firms that you're working with, you're engaging with, dialoguing with on consumer duty?
I'll take this one then. I mean, I think from my standpoint, we're working with a lot of firms reviewing what they've currently done in terms of how they're getting ready, what they've got ready so far. And I mean, I think the poll results here certainly give a good indication and sort of run with a constant theme that not every firm is going to be ready come 31st of July. And I think actually, that is a fair assessment. I mean, when the question's asked, will you be fully compliant? That includes, looking at your distribution chain, looking at the whole chain from end to end, and actually, have you got everything in place that you absolutely need? How sure are you that that data is there? And that's what we've been looking at with firms, to date, and trying to sort of ascertain where firms can actually pick up some easy wins for themselves to move forward.
Yeah, Philip, I think it's quite interesting. That's quite reflective of some of the data that we're going to look at in a minute from the Ipsos FCA survey. So if you to add together the don't ask category, which still makes me smile, and the 27%, you're over 40% of people. So I get the fully. We're going to dig down into that in a little bit more detail to help you gauge where you are relative to your peers. Hopefully you'll find that useful.
Yes, indeed. Okay, so second question as well. Give you a bit more time on this one, conscious that you're going to have to read through some of the answers, so I'll try and abbreviate it. What gaps still exist in your firm's approach to consumer duty? Yeah, multi-choice answer here. What gaps still exist in this? And if you're familiar with these questions, they are based on the FCA's questions there. So what gaps is it? Is it testing products and services, assessing products and services? Yeah, especially through the lens of vulnerability, conducting fair value assessments. I'm not going to lead the witness on any of these, by the way, but producing data and MI, testing comms, adapting comms, producing data around customer feedback is again on vulnerability there, quality and availability of post-sale support. So that's the consumer support outcome there, aligning and ensuring individuals understand their role and competency around consumer duty, and identifying and mitigating key risks to deliver good outcomes there. Okay, give you a bit more time there. In terms of like preparedness, Graham, for individuals and organizations there, is there a sense that there's an understanding of the fundamentals and the basic principles? Organizations still not talking about TCF, are they? And it's just an upgrade on that, or are they still harking back to those and thinking, gosh, there's no change here?
I think this is where some of the confusion really has come in, and some of the gaps are showing in terms of firms that believe that this is nothing more than enhanced TCF, or it's just the FCA restating some of its former and past arguments about putting consumers at the front, where actually it is a complete new change, and it's a sea change. It's pulling everything together, but it's also enhancing it. So I do think that firms need to take stock and actually realize that the FCA is serious, is looking at the cross-cutting rules in particular, look at it against foreseeable harm, supporting their financial objectives, supporting consumers' financial objectives and acting in good faith. And this it goes further than the TCF rules do. You could argue, one would argue anyway, at least I would, coming from my consultancy background. I think you really need to look at every aspect of basically the consumer, consumer journey, the monitoring and everything else that goes on behind the scenes, and actually what you're putting out there for your clients that are receiving it.
When I look at those poll results, Adrian, I see data MI as 57% around the monitoring fair value, and I see data MI again around vulnerability there.
Yeah, it's consistent, isn't it? We do, like you said, we do this every month, or pretty much. We run something on consumer duty every month, and the recurring theme, what keeps you awake at night would appear to be management information. And I think that speaks to Graham's point about TCF. A lot of firms have got their governance set up for a landscape which was TCF, and that's moved on considerably now. And one of the things, one of the stark differences for me around TCF to consumer duty is this requirement on firms to source or to provide new sources of data to evidence their compliance. And it sort of turns on its head. You know, there's an assumption that they were complying previously. Now there's an overt show me. It is a considerably higher test.
Exactly. And when we look at what changes firms can make, even in the 10 days, less than 10 days that we've got there, Graham, yeah, we pulled out the Ipsos survey. I'll post that in the chat so you can have a look at that there. This was a survey of firms that the FCA asked Ipsos to conduct there. We were doing a pre-webinar meeting and we started unpicking this data, and shock, horror, gasp, we were going, no, are you sure? And thoughts and feelings, Graham, first of all you, and Adrian then follow up on that.
Yeah, I mean, I think we both came to sort of the point of, you know, no one answered 100%. You know, there is no 100% there at all. So no one is fully understanding every single part of the consumer duty necessarily. You know, we can't see, you know, looking right down the bottom there, the cross-cutting rules are the lowest understood. I mean, if you're not understanding it now, you've got a very short space of time in which you can get up to speed. And I think, you know, looking to I know the next slide is coming, but I think looking to that also gives a good indication of where the issues really lie. And it's actually quite scary. If I were a consumer, I'd be quite concerned at this point, and I am a consumer, so it's worrying.
The bit that stands out for me, and that we were kicking around earlier today in our planning, was the phrase. The question says, how well do you feel you understand? So do you understand this legislation? I'd expect that to be, I mean, I mean, funny, it's not the most complex. I'm not a lawyer, but it's not the most complex legislation that I've seen come from the regulator. I would expect most of those scores to be at, yeah, we get it. So if you don't understand it halfway through July, what chance have you got of actually implementing it after the end of July? It seems really basic, but, and then maybe that's moved on because it's a few weeks old, but
that but again reinforces, when we look at that score, one of the lowest scores there is cross-cutting rules and also data and metrics. You know, still struggling around the outcomes, measuring and monitoring outcomes, which is going to be a serious measure and an indicator of whether you understand whether you are delivering to the customer's satisfaction and the FCA's expectation. When we look at consumer duty and the supply chain, Graham, again, you know what, you guys laugh, but you know,
no, I laugh because I'm scared. You look at the data there, you know, 1,200-ish firms, you know, just over 1,200 firms were surveyed. And of that, you're saying, you know, 30% of those haven't worked with their partners, or, you know, don't think it's applicable to have worked across the supply chain. You know, there's an obligation on every single firm that's involved in a chain to basically effectively dob the other one in under the principles if they're not complying with the duty. There's no escaping it.
My favorite, Graham, my favorite one is 100 firms don't think customer vulnerability applies.
Yeah, I mean, you deal with a consumer, you will be dealing at some point with someone that is vulnerable, guaranteed. There is no two ways about it. You know, you can't say that it's not applicable.
Okay. So if basically everybody's not quite pulling in the same direction, I know that trade associations and trade bodies are trying to support that and trying to engage that, making sure distributors and manufacturers are singing from the same hymn sheet there. Graham, what can firms do to identify basically the gaps and then close those gaps?
Yeah, I mean, I think this was something I was going to touch on the last slide, but I mean, you know, a lot of that data that's, you know, a lot of the firms that have the sort of the lower understanding at the bottom of the survey there is, you know, it's all about the management information. It is a work in progress, and FCA understands that as well. You are going to have in your mind, you're going to have a mindset of what information you're going to need to gather and how and who from. But actually on the day, and you know, we'll talk about this when we come to, you know, business as usual and post 31st of July, but you won't know necessarily if you're getting the right information at the right time, and how that information is provided to you. Who's providing it to you? Is it directly provided? Are you getting it through third parties? You know, that's where it's all going to be a moving element. And I think, that there has to be, quite an intense scrutiny from the first, 3 to 6 months of the information you're actually getting back, to then interpreting that information and actually making it usable and practical.
Adrian, only less than 50% of surveyed firms, I understand who their target market is or identified that.
I look at this. Graham said scared. I'm looking at. I'm thinking, wow, people have just have they overshared, or is this just is this genuinely reflective? I mean, if you don't know who your target market is, we were talking about when was this? When should this filing have been done? And the board filing was back in October, wasn't it? Last year.
The implementation plan. If you look at that, over half of the firms are still in progress with developing an implementation plan. Now, whether that means they've got one in place and it's being tweaked because they've already done it, but this was required to be up at board level in October of last year. So, and FCA has questioned firms on this. I've seen emails, asking firms for implementation plan, asking for all the information that's been discussed, the minutes, the committee meetings, everything to do with consumer duty and what the firm is doing about it.
I'm not even going to talk to the 100-odd firms that haven't started.
Yeah, but there's also
they should talk to me.
Is it? Yeah, I mean, there's an accountability, Graham, isn't there? Conduct Rule 4 to actually make sure that you, as a senior manager, are making sure that you've got the right information and providing the right information there. So, this has teeth.
I mean, there's Conduct Rule 4, you're looking at Principle 12, and you're also looking at the rules in print as well, where, FCA basically will have insight on every step of the journey. And that will be done through reporting, and you're stuck.
Yes, and talking about journey, cue nice slide, which is basically, at every point in time across that customer journey, there is an expectation, isn't there, to actually make sure the customer is put at the forefront of touch points, making sure that this is frictionless as possible, recognizing biases that happen. But this is important from an employee competency point of view, from pre-sale, Adrian, to post-sale there. And certainly don't get your ducks in order. It has seriously consequences right through the customer journey.
Yeah, I mean, anyone who's been on a webinar with me in the past will know I just bang on about this training and competency and the sort of the one-size-fits-all tick box approach that has become the default in the market. That's got to change. If that's your go-to source of evidence that your employees are competent and able to ensure that the customer's being treated fairly, I think you're on a weak footing. Can I share my little story? This from earlier this week when I was renewing my phone contract. I won't name the supplier for fear of some sort of litigation, but a very large supplier is not a customer of ours. I was asked to renew my phone contract, was given a price for 2 years, and said, I don't really want a 2-year contract because you're going to move the price during that 2-year period of time anyway, which in itself feels like an unfair practice. So just give me a price for a 1-year contract. And the agent said to me, oh, that's much more expensive. It's much, much more expensive. I'm like, okay, so just give me a price. He said, well, you might as well just stay on the price you're on at the moment, which by the way was 28 quid. And the 2-year price was 18 quid. So they're offering me a £10 reduction over what I was currently paying. And I said, no, I really want a price for the 12-month contract. He went, okay, that's £19. So he led me to believe it was really much, much more expensive to go to a 1-year contract. He then suggested I stay on my current contract at 28 quid instead of 19. And I pointed out to him that he had misled me, and he just wasn't interested, not in the least bit interested. So that's just weak. So how many firms out there where is that training got? It's not, in fairness to the agent, it may not be training, it may be remuneration, it could be all sorts of things going on there. But where is that? I mean, that is a clear and obvious breach. I was customer detriment. I was completely unfairly treated, and it was only my obstinate personality that made me keep asking for the 12-month price that unearthed the fact that it was only £1 more a month.
Yeah.
Sorry, I'm just penning an email to Martin Lewis as we speak to raise that there. But it raises an interesting point, doesn't it, Graham, which is that addressing foreseeable harm at every stage of the journey, anticipating that in your product creation and your service development, and actually making sure that you're constantly testing throughout this journey about where foreseeable harm could be addressed or can be mitigated.
It's the whole life cycle you have to look at. You have to look at, start to finish, all the way from, how a firm allows individuals to cancel, or how, indeed, as Adrian encountered, how you get to repurchase or recontract with someone, or reinvest, even if it's, looking at asset management and things like that. How easy is it? Do you want a barrier to entry and exit? No, that's the whole idea of breaking down those barriers to this.
What you see on the screen here is the latest YouGov survey through the lens or the understanding of customers who were basically interviewed about what they thought banks responded to helping them make the right decisions, or alternatively anticipate or prevent potential harm. And if you look at this in terms of like whether they're doing a good job or a poor job, obviously the big headline here is nearly half of Britons say that banks aren't doing enough to prevent harm. There is a real issue between what customers think, Graham, and what firms are thinking that they're doing to prevent consumer harm here. How can they bridge that gap? How can they do that far more effectively to the satisfaction of the end customer?
I mean, broadly, it's going to be coming down to knowing who your customers are, knowing more about them. And I think, it's been put quite well in some of the FCA's podcasts and other publications, where they've said, look at it, and it's going to be an intent, the first few months are going to be quite intensive customer interaction. And by having those customer interactions, you can actually then build up a better picture of who your customer is, or who your customers are. I mean, although looking back at slide 8 with the target market, it's questionable as to whether firms know who their target market is. But I think it's basically looking at, who the target market is, who the customer is. Are there any ways that you can enhance or simplify the journey and the marketing or the materials that you're providing, to basically end up with the cross, to satisfying the cross-cutting rules of, reducing the foreseeable harm.
How simple is simple, though, when you're actually creating customer communications and engagements?
There's no correct answer to that. I think it's going to be, it depends on the product, and it depends on the service, because inherently some products are complex. If you take the CFD market, for example, it's inherently complex and a risky product. The communications that are sent out in relation to that need to contain all the data and information for the consumer to make that, informed decision, if you like, and understand the risks. I mean, aside from, previous FCA publications around, making sure that the people involved are, appropriate to be involved in those types of transactions. But I think it's basically balancing it against ensuring complete and accurate information, and making sure they can make an informed decision, I think.
Critical, the first line has such an important role to play in consumer understanding, don't they, Adrian?
Well, yeah, like my little mobile phone fiasco. So yes, the front line's where the rubber hits the road, and for me, I think this will prove to be an Achilles heel for a lot of firms. There is a huge amount of responsibility being foisted onto the front line to get this right in difficult situations. And in fact, I just wrote an article. It'll be out soon, and we'll share it. But we were looking at a phenomenon that we've seen with financial services firms in particular, where they've got high attrition in the first 180 days of employment. And when we dig into that, we find out that that's due to a lack of competence in role, and the individual feeling they are incapable of performing that role, and they're exiting the organization. I mean, there is a really clear indicator. And one of the things we've seen with COVID as well, or post-COVID, is a lot of firms have digitalized a lot of the journey. So they've taken out a lot of the easy to serve stuff. So when I do get through to an agent, inevitably the degree of complexity of that call is much greater. So therefore the agent is required to have a higher level of competence. What's changed in the training approach? It's still tick a box, lowest cost to get that agent served. A lot of agents are working hybrid, meaning that they, the peer-to-peer learning, which is about 70% of the value, that's diluted. They're in the office 2 days a week. Yeah, so they're only getting 40% of the benefit. That assumes that the person with all the knowledge is in the office at the same time. It's a big issue, and it is, in my opinion, a chasm, to use Graham's word, that a lot of firms are going to fall into, because one of the things the regulator's asking for is evidence that these employees are competent, evidence that they're able to do that. And a key component of the regulator's strategy is that the front line are going to put their hand up, say, excuse me, boss, this doesn't seem fair. We need to fix this. So I just had a conversation with this bloke, Adrian Harvey, and it really felt like I was ripping him off. So in order for that to happen, that agent needs to be confident, to do so. And that comes from absolute competence. And if you were to look at all of you, look in the mirror a moment and say, is the evidence that I have about my frontline employees granular? Is it factual, or is it a feeling? They'll be all right. You might not be. Or I know absolutely it's this level. And one of the things we talked about before we started this, Philip, is, rather than lecturing people on the webinar, say, well, what can you do to resolve this? Look, I would say this, but we've got tech that you can put in 90 days, right? And you're up and running, and you've solved that problem. So it isn't about, in my opinion, being absolutely one and done on the 31st of July. That's unrealistic. It is a journey. I think you need to have shown that you've taken reasonable steps. Now, if you haven't appointed somebody and you haven't got a plan and you're somewhat further down the line, that's another issue. But if you have done that sort of stuff, I think you do need to look at your front line. You do need to say, how have I supported them in order for them to support the customers as the regulator wants me to? I think that's the challenging question for me, for a lot of people on that.
100% there. Graham, when we look at price and value, obviously firms should have been doing their fair value assessments, and how are firms progressing in this, and what gaps do they still have around that?
Yeah, I mean, I think there was a lot of we had a lot of queries at the outset of how do you assign fair value? What is fair value? What is fair? And I suppose really it's then again looking at, it's not just prices. It's not just the price you charge or the fees you receive versus what your competition may be charging. What added value? What USP? What makes you different? I suppose turning it around, ask a question of yourself. Why are you charging what you're charging? What makes it fair? I hate using that word. I hate using the FCA's words against people, but why are you charging what you're charging? Is there a reason for it? Is there a rationale? Can you explain? Can you stand in front of the FCA and say, this is why I'm charging this, because we believe that we provide X, Y, and Z better or differently to our competitors, and actually, we go the extra mile outside of, just the day-to-day advice or the day-to-day insurance contract or whatever it may be, or the investment management we do is so unique and bespoke that that's why we charge the extra amount. I mean, again, you then look at what may be fair for one client or one customer, might not be so fair for the other. I mean, we may have different charging structures. You may look at it in terms of, if you've got a sufficiently granular target market analysis, which again, questionable as to whether firms do, based on the Ipsos survey, I hasten to add, but look at that and see, is one client more likely to be charged more, or should they be charged more? Do they use you more? Do they use the service more? Do they get more benefits? There's a whole raft of questions that firms can be asking themselves, as to why. And bear in mind that FCA are going to be looking for justification. Price and value is one of the core elements. It's one of the core outcomes.
One of my points was, if you have a product and you're not using it, that's very obvious to a firm. It's very, very obvious. You'll see that. Yeah, that reporting will exist today. And if I look at consumer duty, I would suggest that organisation has a duty to that customer during the term to go to the customer and ask them, are you getting value from this product? Now, I'm a business person. I think businesses exist to make money, right? Profit is not a swear word. It's perfectly appropriate. Profit at the expense of the customer is not appropriate, and that's what consumer duty is setting out to.
Exactly. I mean, the FCA has even said, they don't expect firms not to make money. That's what firms are in business to do. But it's, again, as you say, at the expense of the consumer is now, is a no-no.
But I'm still surprised by the Ipsos survey about how far behind at a planning stage. In other webinars, you've heard me refer to this as sort of the desk-based component of consumer duty. This is sit down months ago and map it out. Months and months ago.
I mean, it is concerning. If you don't know what you're selling, how can you then be delivering those good outcomes to the client?
So when we look at consumer support and joining the dots up between support throughout the whole journey here, and I want to actually move it on through a lens, also looking through the lens of vulnerability as well. Is there a case that when firms are struggling with perhaps, Adrian, some sort of data or MI, that they want to get to Everest before they even get to base camp? So they're looking for the optimal MI and data, rather than actually starting off with perhaps the tactical data and MI that they could evidence that good support is in order. What steps can they take to using technology or even a different approach to training that is simple but also effective to say that they've at least started?
Yeah, look, you make a number of points. For me, this is about steps. Yeah, I sometimes do come across firms who have a perfect lens. Yeah, well, we're not going to do anything until we've got it all perfect. In my experience, when I've run regulated firms, it always landed better, in my opinion, to be able to evidence that you are taking steps towards the desired outcome than waiting, or yes, I'm doing something in the background. So I think you need to be taking active steps. For me, this is about culture. Yeah. And of organizational culture. This comes up again and again, and I wonder how firms, the role employees, frontline employees in particular, play in the culture of a firm is critical. And we see through some polling we've done some disparity from the, let's say, senior managers and frontline staff when they report on the culture of their business. So if your approach to supporting and training these employees doesn't enable them to treat customers fairly, yeah, and ensure they get the best outcomes, then I would go right back to what do we need to change? And what a single point in time, it is the worst kept secret in the market. It doesn't work. Yeah, a single point in time training, tick the box, get on with it, and go back a year later and do a refresher. It doesn't work. You need a new source of, new sources of data. You need new management information, and you should be assessing your employees continually. You should be using this data as a lead indicator rather than waiting for customer detriment to act as a lag indicator. Whilst it won't give you all of the answers, it will act as a forward-facing risk radar for you and show you where your business has weaknesses and gaps. So I would say you need to go to a continual assessment regime for that.
Graham, we've talked about, touched about it in the 10 questions, the approach
Yeah.
of vulnerability and the challenges around vulnerability. Some firms have been found wanting in this area for a number of years. It's not just consumer duty there. Obviously, front and center comes the identification of vulnerability, doesn't it? And therefore trying to do something about it. And if you read the latest surveys, that there's a great proportion of individuals that could be considered vulnerable, not just now when you've purchased the product, but potentially foreseeable harm in the future. How are firms how are firms getting on with their identification process? And what could firms be doing differently that could sow a seed for addressing any gaps in their vulnerability or approach to vulnerability?
Yeah, I mean, interestingly, we go back again to the Ipsos survey, and 10% or 120 firms, then it doesn't apply to them. So why are they worried? If you're not worried about vulnerability, then or how you identify vulnerable customers, then there's a massive issue. There's a big issue there. I think looking at it. One survey says, over 56% of the population have applied for some sort of financial product online within the last 12 months. And of them, 82%, so 8 out of 10 people have a condition or something that makes them more likely to be vulnerable to harm. Now, I mean, you've got FG 21.1 there, which is an older, I say an older publication, but I mean, it's relevant. It is completely relevant here in terms of how you understand the need of your target market, your customer base, ensure your staff have the right skills and capabilities, respond to the customer needs throughout the product design, and be flexible in terms of how you provide the customer services, how you provide or how you receive communications, how you communicate with your clients, how they can communicate with you. Think of all the different ways that can be accessed. And then it's about monitoring and assessing it going forward. But I think, in the 10 questions that FCA's put out there, is asking you whether your firm's products or services have features that could risk harm for groups of customers with vulnerabilities, or with characteristics of vulnerability. Now, that could be anything from a minor issue right through to a life-threatening condition.
Yeah, absolutely. And the challenge is that it's all driven by data. Sometimes when we've done webinars in the past on consumer duty, Adrian, it's just as much down to a change in culture as is with a change in the data and an MI that you actually receive from that. And you have to have a different mindset, don't you? The organization has a different mindset to interrogating the data, to reviewing the data, and not being scared of the data that it throws up, or the MI it throws up afterwards there. And that's why we've asked this question: how confident are you that you have the appropriate data and MI available to meet your consumer duty obligations? So how confident are you that you have the appropriate MI and data to meet your consumer duty obligations?
An example of where this comes up in our daily life is firms saying, we've got we can evidence that Adrian was trained and is therefore competent. I would suggest that perhaps you might be measuring the wrong thing. You're measuring an event has occurred rather than an outcome, which is a level of competence. And if you point to the short-term memory test at the end of the training as your level of competence, that's a very weak standard. And a lot of that training will be theoretical. It's not a pub quiz, right? No one's particularly interested in knowledge. What the regulator's interested in is how that knowledge translates into in-role competence. So where's your assessment of in-role competence? And when and how accurate? When is it accurate of? How have you genuinely assessed that individual is competent and can identify whether a customer is vulnerable or not? Not knows the theory. That's completely separate. That's me having read a manual on riding a bicycle, having never ridden one before. I go outside, get on a bicycle, fall off. That's because it's a competence. It's not a short-term memory test. So we see this a lot, and I would just urge caution with an open mind, look at your sources of data and ask yourself the question, are we actually measuring the right thing? Because in terms of employee training and competence, I would suggest most firms on this webinar are measuring that an event has occurred, and that is that some training has occurred. That is not what's required. You need to evidence that Adrian's competent in respect of that category of knowledge.
Graham, 40% say somewhat confident in their data and MI that they've got.
Yeah, I mean, look, I would challenge anyone that says that they're extremely confident that they have the MI available. I mean, I think, you know, you're going to be relying on others in the chain to provide you with that information, or, you know, even if you are both the manufacturer and distributor, you need to be sure that you're getting meaningful MI back, and you know, it's all about the appropriate data in MI, and then how, in terms of that, are you then measuring good outcomes? You know, even FCA have said they don't expect firms to have it right on day one, but it's going to be, as long as you've got something demonstrable in place that actually shows what you're doing to work towards those good outcomes, then you know that will provide comfort, or provide more comfort than firms that have done nothing or very little towards it.
So when we look at good MI and good data, we've actually picked 8 tests or assessment whether your data is fit for purpose in no particular order, because I'm conscious of time here. Graham, what stands out for you in terms of, like, you know, what good data looks like and what good MI off the back of data looks like?
Sure. I mean, I think, you know, you've got to look at it as this is evolving data, basically. And I think looking at governance, MI is received on a constant basis currently by boards. There's nothing new there, but except that this is now more focused. The board needs to have that salient information. It needs to be succinct enough for the board to actually analyze and basically provide an opinion on, because they are responsible at the end of the day for challenging, you know, at board level and discussed at board level how the firm is complying with the duty. You know, it's SMCR related, it is the champion related. It's all going to come down to the board and how they apply the management information they receive. So they need to be receiving the necessary management information for them to be able to ensure that actually the firm is meeting its obligations. So you're looking at things: are the right questions being asked? What are the questions being asked? What's the feedback being given? You know, it's not going to go into the granular level necessarily, but if there's something that's missing, then it needs to be taken back to source. And you're going to be looking, you know, effectively looking at all of these areas that you've got here, and making sure that the internal and external sources are providing that information to you.
Adrian, you talked about forward-looking indicators versus lagging indicators beforehand, but number 5, real-time insights, critical that you have real-time data feeds and MI to make sure that you're anticipating problems before they become major risks to the business.
Yeah, I think a lot of firms have got real-time MI, Philip, and I think this is a gentle nudge to say, have you got the real-time MI that you need? A lot of firms are awash with data, and it's sieving through that to find out the stuff that they need that drives the right sort of evidence. For me, it's about real-time. So let me give you an example. I've got real-time data related to how well we're serving our customers. It's called a complaint log. Yeah, the challenge with that is it relies on customer detriment as your litmus test. You have to have harmed the customer, yeah, for them to complain, yeah, for you to use that data to fix the problem, hopefully. Yeah. So when the regulator says to you, how are you assessing that you're delivering fair service to these people? Well, we count our complaints. We get a few thousand a week, and we act on them. That's a few thousand customers harmed every week. So we would look at it from the point of view of saying, what are the likely drivers of those complaints? You probably know. Yeah. You should be looking forward and establishing what competence employees have in relation of those drivers and fixing them up front. So that forward-looking thing, they fit together.
I nearly dazzled you, Adrian, by moving the slides onto this. You nearly took a step backwards in your seat there. I saw that. You know,
Fell off the seat.
Hate this slide.
it was the strobe effect that caught you off guard there. But I thought, thought we'd put this in simply because we wanted to know that there are clear data sources that you need and have, Graham, but there's also data that is driven by, you'll see at the bottom of your picture here, the boards will expectation, customer facing roles will expect, you know, obviously risk and compliance and obviously internal audit there. But there's key areas where you're going to have to mine different data sources, Graham, to satisfy your anticipating, like Adrian says, foreseeable harm. And there's other stuff where you're going to have to go back and revisit your data lakes and your data pools to actually ask better questions around that, so you draw out the MI. What's your take on new data and existing data pools that your firms, your consultancy are working through?
I think we're working through, you know, currently boards are looking for the aggregated view. They don't want you know, too much of a granular approach necessarily. They're looking for, you know,
I think we've lost you, Graham. Adrian, are you still there? Okay.
Yeah.
Do you want to just talk us through, whilst we get Graham back? You know, we talked about data from an external perspective. Oh yeah, Graham, Graham, so we lost you right there.
Cue me. Just sorry, I've lost the screen now.
Yeah,
no,
talking about MI for the board and the expectation, not necessarily for granularity, but also just an aggregation of that data so that they've got some real-time insights.
Yeah, I mean, it's granular, show trends, and basically they need to, the board needs to be sure that they can manage the risks and are aware of the issues. You know, obviously on an annual basis, they're required to report whether consumers are receiving, you know, or review whether consumers are receiving outcomes that are consistent with the duty. And in turn, you know, it is going to be all fed in through the relevant teams that are underlying, you know, the reporting structures within the board. So I mean, that's where it's really coming from, and the drivers we're seeing is a shift from sort of the standard day-to-day information to receiving more specific and focused information on particular areas.
People talking about transitioning to BAU after 31st of July, other people calling it day 2. What does day 2 look like there? We've identified 3 key areas: processes and frameworks, obviously the embedding of that, cultural uplift and continuous improvement there as 3 key areas that need to focus on. What type of questions, Graham, should firms be asking themselves to embed or BAU into their business, or consumer duty BAU into their business?
I mean, I think, you know, you've got to remember that it's the start point. This is when it goes live. I mean, what are you budgeting? What resources have you dedicated to ensuring that you're meeting the consumer duty requirements, both, you know, initially, but more importantly on an ongoing basis? What's your testing doing? What is it giving you? What information is coming back? Is it the right information? What more do you need to get? What's missing? How well does that information align to any regulatory expectations? Do you know what the FCA's expectations are? Again, coming back to the Ipsos survey, you know, there seems to be some confusion there. And how do you know, how can you ensure that actually what you've done and what you've put in place and what you're going to put in place, you know, you can keep repeating it on an ongoing basis and make it easier for yourself to monitor? I mean, you don't want it to be a purely labor intensive role for the next however long it may be. And I mean, you know, hopefully it'll be for the next 10, 15, 20, 30 years or more, you know, as long as the firm's in existence.
Adrian, you focused on 2 areas on BAU. Number 1, culture, and number 2, your approach to learning. Do you want to just unpack those 2 elements a bit more detail?
And Graham, while I do, you might want to look at the chat, because there's some specific comment there that looks like it resonates very well with workplace pension providers, Philip, who believed that they were out of scope because they were providing services to businesses, but ultimately there was a consumer involved, and the regulator ruled really quite firmly that they were covered by consumer duty, which sent that particular segment of the market scurrying around really quite late to deal with that. But Graham, you might want to just add something in there on the chat, because quite a few people zooming in on that. Sorry, Philip, your question was?
Culture and learning, as making that BAU after the 31st of July.
Yeah. I'm cultural change. It takes a long time. It takes a long time, and it takes a huge amount of effort, and I think it can be very distracting. So, in the nicest possible way, yeah, I think firms have got to, at the very highest level, make this a commitment. We are going to do this. It's a flywheel effect, and it just needs to be. It needs to be the dare I say, the number one thing on the agenda. We need to transition our business, and that sort of assumes that the culture in the business currently, not my statement, it's the regulators, isn't where the regulator wants it to be. Yeah, so I dare say firms are going to choose where they are on that line, and what does good look like? It's tricky. What I do know is that good doesn't look like an employee base that has a level of competence about half what they need to have to do that job. And that's a data point we get from almost every new customer. We do at least one a week. Yeah, the data point is pretty consistent. Employees know about half what they need to know to do their job properly. So that's what I'd zoom in on, Philip. It's that you can't act on training you haven't learned and transitioned into in-role competence.
Yeah, and in terms of Graham, taking firms to where they are now, and let's say that's the 31st of July, to good outcomes, what's expected by regulators, what's expected by staff, and also by customers there. What questions do they need to ask to focus that discussion and zero in on those key good outcomes?
I think it is basically coming back to looking at, where is the gap? What is the gap? And how can we basically move from, where you currently are, wherever that may be on the scale of preparedness and understanding, to actually meeting the good outcomes? Or are you already there in part and you just need to tweak things and take it from there?
Testing and monitoring, thoughts on that, because that's going to be an iterative process, tweaking those controls and making sure that they're robust enough. But also, are they asking the right questions? Are they assessing and monitoring the right things? Yeah. Okay, right. Questions. I don't know if there's any questions that you can share that you've responded to, Graham, in the chat, or Adrian, that you want to pick up and share. I know that people are posting those questions anyway. Really good. If you would share your questions or post any comments about what we've discussed so far, and it would be useful. We're trying to address
some quite detailed, Philip. Some are quite detailed and require a more considered response than a little chit chat. In previous webinars, we have hooked these questions out and sent a response, specifically to those questions to all attendees. So my suggestion, Philip, is we just wash this Q&A for any of those sorts of questions and respond to all attendees once we've covered off the answer.
Good. Final thoughts from us. Obviously, you can access a whole suite of resources from both ourselves at Elephants Don't Forget and also Complyport. We'd love to hear how we can actually support you in your implementation, but also support ongoing journey to apply to the expectations of the regulator there on day 2, or implementing and reinforcing and making sure that it's BAU activity. We've asked you if you'd like to indicate signing up to Elephants Don't Forget and Complyport range of blogs and podcasts and webinars as such, and also booking a demo to embed and evidence consumer duty, care of Elephants Don't Forget. Also discussing with Graham directly how you can review and improve not only your consumer duty implementation plans, but also the ongoing work which is needed and to support your organization going forward there. Certainly a number of you have posted your questions in. I appreciate that. I don't know if there's any in the chat that we could quickly fire off before we close down this. this webinar. Some really good questions. Really,
Yeah,
really good.
the link will be in the. So all of these slides will be sent to everyone who posted a legitimate email address. You'll get a copy of the slides. In the slides is the link. Yeah, so you'll be able to see that with the slides.
Brilliant there. And certainly there'll be a number of webinars coming from yourselves, I know, at Complyport to support customers going forward with consumer duty. Certainly we've got, we're drilling down into some key areas. I think evidencing outcomes is going to be a critical one there. So watch this space in terms of like what we can do to support you as well. Number of firms from compliance, risk, and also internal audit, Graham, in terms of where you see the direction of travel going, in terms of like how the regulator is going to enforce consumer duty, what are your thoughts on that?
Given the wide impact of this, I think the only way, and looking at some of the numbers involved, I think the only way they're going to do this is the usual way of desk-based reviews and surveys. So I can envision and expect that firms will receive a survey within 3 to 6 months, maybe even less. And I think basically you're looking to respond to those surveys. Make sure you watch out for any trigger questions, any areas that look like they might be looking at the 4 outcomes, or what you're doing and what information you're getting and receiving and what changes you've made. I think, you know, anything that sort of looks at what have you done to improve, or what have you done to change what you've got, what you had originally in place and where you are now. Just make sure that watch out for any surveys. Basically, that's
the one for me, Graham. What have you changed?
The FCA basically came out with a survey on, I think it was to do with anti-money laundering and information, asking for firms on that. They then subsequently turned it around and used it as an inroad to ask about consumer duty as well, and that really put the cat amongst the pigeons.
Mm-hmm. And in terms of, Adrian, starting points for firm, you know, concerned about data and MI, is it just a question of getting started and actually just dipping your toe in the water, or jumping straight in to the deep end on this? I couldn't think of another analogy, by the way.
Well, I'd like to think, given the amount of time that firms have had, that there might be some pre-thought rather than just diving in the deep end and deciding whether you can swim or not. So I dare say most of the people on this webinar, Philip, I hope, have given this a lot of consideration. That's why they're here. In relation to some of the stuff we've talked about today, I don't think it's ever too late. And I think, to Graham's point, when the regulators asking you questions or surveying you what's changed, there's stuff that you have changed and there's stuff that you are going to change. Yeah, and I think it's about prioritizing that and having some valid prioritization to say, look, I positioned this as more important than that. Yeah, I just can't do everything. And I think the regulator's going to in a space where they look at that and say that's reasonable. But at some point in time, I'm going to predict that the regulator's going to zone in on certain things. I'm going to say vulnerability. Yeah, and the regulator's going to zone in on that. My suggestion will be in the next 6 months, and they're going to come back with a dear CEO or something like that to say this isn't good enough.
Yes,
that'll be my prediction. So you get the you'll get the steer from the regulator pretty quickly, I think.
On that positive note, thank you. Thank you very much. Great to participate. Great for your engagement. Give us feedback on our webinars. We've got broad shoulders enough to take it and absorb it as well. We will get back to you in terms of how we can answer your questions. And oh, thanks for the hand claps. And that's very kind of you. But also we'll give you a nod to yes, we'll give you a nod to the podcasts that the FCA have posted if you haven't seen those already. 10 questions, we'll post that link. You've got the Ipsos survey there. Oh, come on, stop it, guys, stop it. It's compliance and regulation, please. All right, sorry, Graham, go on.
How many of these are colleagues?
yeah. We don't measure that. Yeah, we have the wrong data and the wrong MI on this.
And your wife, Philip.
Yeah.
we need to adjust the MI.
Go on. Thank you very much, everybody. Really appreciate your time.
All.
Take care, guys.
Bye.